Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales. This is a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week is micro-episode week, except I have so many micro-episodes that I'm going to just make them full length. The idea of micro-episode week is to allow me to use up plot ideas that have been sitting in my notebooks for a while. I've noticed that ideas that go out to the community and circulate around a little tend to come back in better forms. That is, when you look at Ars Magica, it's often the second or third attempt that we make at something that's the good one. So this lets me get the primary idea out the way. It lets me put the pieces out there in the ether so that any of you have some ideas can connect these to other ideas you have, and hopefully in a week or a month or a year I'll see them reflected back in some more beautiful form. Far better than if I just left them in my notebooks. It does lead to a slightly disjointed episode, so if you're new to the podcast, choose pretty much any of the other ones. So you're going to be getting heaps of micro episodes packed together into longer episodes a couple of times this week. Rossini's wigs. A little trivia can lead to a plot hook. Recently on No Such Thing as a Fish, which is a podcast run by the people who do the research for the television program QI, they mentioned that the composer Rossini was terribly embarrassed by his baldness, so he had 10 wigs made, each slightly longer than the one before, and he wore them in a weekly sequence. He made sure to comment to people that he was going to visit the barber, and then switch back to the shortest. On thinking about this, I was immediately struck by the idea that this prevented you from having your hair used against you as an arcane connection. So as a plot hook, the Covenant's stables have burst into flame. Once you control the fire and save most of the horses and supplies, you discover one of the animals is dead. Basic divination makes it the source of the fire, but how is that possible? Horses don't just explode. One of your senior magi wears a horsehair wig, and his enemy cast a pylon of fire using hairs from that wig as an arcane connection. He struck the horse, incinerated it, and that set the hay in the stables to flame. How can you keep the elder mages safe while tracing his attempted murderer? And how do you deal with them, given that they must have great skill at magic to open an intangible tunnel? Looking a little more into Rossini, I discovered that his workspace was oddly geometric. Everything had its precise place, including his wigs, which were kept in their order on busts. People who visited him were astonished, because back then opera composers were libertines. If you've seen the movie Amadeus, people were expected to live like that, a sort of squalor that only the truly rich can manage. I like that he was so persnickety, partly because I have OCD and we like to claim every historical genius as ours, but it makes him sound more like a magus. A twilight scar could have caused his incurable baldness. Tycho Brahe's nose. The astronomer Tycho Brahe lost his nose during a duel at university, so he wore a prosthetic one. I won't be able to stop myself until I call this a prosthetic proboscis, so I'll get that out of the way now. He had several. He had a brass one for everyday wear, and he had a court nose, which was gilded. So that was for when he was swanning about with royalty. A long time ago, I considered fairy prosthetic limbs, but now I'm trying to write up Stellaspa Covenant, which is an astronomical sept of Crean magi, and I can't help thinking that cutting off your nose to use a prosthetic nose that previously belonged to a great astronomer might be some sort of initiation ritual. Crean and magi tend to be aloof from human contact at best, so making changes to their faces might not count as a flaw. Nevertheless, the nose of Tycho Brahe is one of those things that, if I were to write it up, people would think I was being silly, and that makes me want to write it up even more. That nose has been next to every telescope that has made every famous discovery by Tycho Brahe. If it's a spirit of artifice, it should be a powerful one, and to make the best use of it, you might have to cut off your nose. Worse, he has two noses, and he used to use them for different purposes. One for serious work as an astronomer, and one for when he was with noblemen. What if the two noses are rivals? What if they force their two wearers into competition? Some minor notes on fairy feasts. This is a tiny bit of colour for fairy feasts from a study by the Institute of Making. Most fairies don't use iron. In Ars Magica, they tend to use bronze or brass weapons instead. That was particularly the case in 2nd and 3rd edition. Now, instead, they use fairy iron, which is a substance that looks like iron only to people who don't really know anything much about iron. Their fairy iron is made out of glamour and ambient matter rather than real iron. Their inability to use iron is a particular difficulty when eating. You see, in the modern time, we use stainless steel in our eating utensils because it doesn't interact with the acids in foods, and it doesn't interact with saliva. Eating food off brass or bronze implements tastes terrible. Similarly, silver dining utensils, although they have been popular historically, taste horrible. Fairy iron and fairy silver may have other flavours. It's possible they're even positive. Some people report that copper utensils make fruit taste sweeter. The Institute suggests that you haven't lived until you've eaten off gold implements, as these have the pure flavour of the food with nothing added in the utensil, gold being all but unreactive. Frankly, if you have the fluorine in your mouth required to make the gold react, you have bigger problems than listening to my podcast. Get to a hospital immediately. The paper I'm reading doesn't consider wood or ceramic utensils, which, particularly in the latter case, can have a similar flavourlessness because they're non-reactive. Many Europeans carry an eating knife with them, so this would be one easy way of telling if a person is a fairy. You would look at their knife, or you would let them use your knife to eat with. Amalfi paper. One day, one of us will write a Venice book. I'm not saying that I'm doing it now. I have a little fiction thing that I'm playing with, but one day one of us will write a Venice book. It's obvious. They're the rising power in 13th century Europe. They're the crossroads where everything meets. And in the setting, because even though Venice has not yet risen to the heights it will reach in the Renaissance, it has been set up as a place where covenants from all over Europe have chapter houses. Someone will write Venice. And that means that someone should write Amalfi. Amalfi is the first of the great naval city-states, the merchant city-states, that trade through the Mediterranean and thereby get money and hire mercenaries and build ships and develop banks. But they fall. And they fall to Venice and to the Normans who invade southern Italy. Venice is built on services, transport, banking, but it has some unique luxury goods, glass particularly. In mythic Europe, as described, that's overemphasized because when I was describing the glass trade in City and Guild, I got that bit wrong. I mistook fine glass for all quite good glass. And at some point, I need to do an episode about forest glass to explain what the rest of Europe was doing for glass, because it's probably what your Covenant mates are doing. In my defence, everyone who'd written about Ars Magica glass previous to this had also been tied into the Venetian magic of glass. So, Amalfi. Amalfi's great treasure, the thing that it made that no one else could make as well, was paper. And paper is one of those evocative things that we know that magi want, like, in some ways, because it would allow their apprentices to study faster from disposable books. In some ways, they need it as a population growth tool, a military preparedness tool. So Amalfi, the great merchant state that is surrounded on all its mountains by water-driven mills that pound cotton fibres into paper. I'm surprised that no one has written it up already. I think perhaps it's that it's very difficult to find materials about Amalfi in English. It is certainly easier to write about Venice. It is certainly easier to write about Norman Sicily and the splendours of the court of Frederick II. But when we write about Frederick II's court, where magicians from east and west meet, where science and architecture take a great leap forward, At least according to folklore, there historically is some argument that he actually retards it through his constant war with the Germans. But when we're doing that, and we're doing Venice, and we're doing Rome, and we're doing Magvillis, it would be very easy to forget little Amalfi. And I think it would be a perfect place for a covenant. Belgian whetstones. The best whetstones in Europe come from Belgium. There's a particular mine there. The stones aren't particularly large. They're a sort of blue, marble-like layered substance. And the Romans made sure that they kept quite a tight hold of that spot while they were in that part of Europe. I keep thinking that one of the local covenants should control that place. Clearly it's something that everyone wants. Everyone wants sharp swords. Everyone wants sharp knives. Everyone wants sharp agricultural tools. And I like the idea of it because when we talk about what covenants do for a living, tying them down to a single commodity can force stories. That's why I suggested in covenants that there is one covenant that makes its money by mining custard. Your covenant probably doesn't have a cauldron. I bought my wife a cauldron recently. It was a birthday present. Moving on. The structure of a cauldron is basically a pot with little legs underneath so that you can pack fuel in. It can be suspended over a fire sometimes if it doesn't have the little legs, but basically it's got the rounded shape it has because it doesn't sit upon a flat surface. That sitting on a flat surface, like what in Australia we call a saucepan, and I'm told by Wikipedia Americans may call a stock pot, that occurs because you've got an oven underneath. The fire in the oven is heating the element, and the element is heating the pot. Now, in the kitchens of many covenants, to save on fuel costs, they have a simple magic item which causes a stone or a piece of metal or a griddle to heat up. Now, if you have that sort of magic item, you don't have cauldrons. You would have something that directly contacts across the entire surface, like a saucepan or a stock pot. And so, because they have invented ovens, the way that hermetic magicians produce food might look entirely different to the way that contemporary people produce food. You could still have some of the dry heat applications like spit roasting, for example. But if you have ovens, cauldrons make less sense. Stockpots make more sense. Baking makes a lot more sense. And not just baking for bread, baking meat. Most of the roasts we now eat aren't actually roasted from a medieval perspective at all. They're baked. So when you go into a covenant kitchen, you're likely to see something far more like a Victorian kitchen, simply because Magi, through being able to heat objects without fuel, have accidentally invented the oven element. This also affects what they cook. It's easier to make omelettes on an element, for example. It's easier to make pancakes on an element. Because it's easier to get closer to the element, it's easier to manipulate the food, so you can have food that you can turn individual pieces of, which allows you to have smaller cuts of meat. So the cuisine of the Order of Hermes may seem strange to cooks from that period. Wine slush. Ice cream hasn't been invented in Europe yet, but it's getting close. In period, there is some reference to people eating wine slush, which is the dregs from wine mixed with snow. This creates a delicacy which is a little bit like shave ice. I imagine that Magi eat this as a festive food. Because they can produce ice easily, they don't have to import it, and that was a business that made certain people very rich, somewhat after the medieval period. Because they can produce ice simply, and because they probably have wine dregs left over, even just from their drinking wine, I imagine that at tribunals, at covenants that are celebrating, you might have something that is, as I say, suspiciously similar to shave ice. Turkish sherbet is not yet known in mythic Europe. I know that it enters English through French, where it's called sorbet. Hot crust pies. The pies which are made in period, hot crust pies, are made by shaping a dough up around a wooden form, which is called a dolly in English. I don't know what they call it in other languages. Blind baking the pie and then stuffing the pie. The fats which go into the pie tend to be things like lard, and it is unusual to eat the outer case of the pie in period. In later periods, less salt is used and more butter is used, so that the case itself becomes edible. Indeed, for some people, the case is the nicest part of the pie. We now call it a crust. In period, it was called a coffin, a word which at the time just meant box. And what you would do is you would pop the top off and scoop the contents out of the coffin and eat them. And that sounds disgusting, and necromancers should probably do that. Oh, that's a good idea. Moving on. Hot crust pies are designed to prevent their contents from going off. The whole point of the crust is to act as cling film. It prevents air reaching the middle of the pie so that the things inside it don't rot. American settlers used to be able to fill a barn with pies during appling season and just thaw one out each morning. The outside of the pie, it doesn't matter how dirty it gets, it doesn't matter if stuff grows on it, so long as nothing gets inside, it's fine. This would be assisted by the resistance to rot and decay that many magic items have. In many pies, particularly pies with meat in them, it was necessary to exclude the air further, and they did that with a thick layer of gelatine. This is called aspic. Aspic pies are those slightly terrifying pies you see in period British dramas. And I was thinking about these pies, and I was thinking they would make a really decent form of potion. Because the problem with potions is you can spill them. I've often thought also that you should have potions in the form of boiled sweets. That way, if you drop them, it doesn't matter. So that's the first set of micro-episodes for this week, all gummed together. I should probably use a pie metaphor here. Can't quite land it. Moving on. There will be another of these episodes gumming together random bits of miscellany out of my notebooks before the end of the week. Your saga may vary, and when it comes to aspic pies, it probably should.